as we think about the role of apologetics in discipling the next generation, think about several pairs of opposites. You've got the individual and the institution, and you've got short-term and long-term. Now, some of you may just be interested in doing a little bit of discipleship with somebody, and that's fine. But especially if you're thinking about really wanting to make a concerted effort to be doing apologetics with young people, then I suggest you think in both of those pairs. Think about what to do now, but also think about the long term. I have some friends who teach at a very elite university in the United States, and they made a 20-year commitment to work at this university, all of them, so that they had a team, a community that was committed to it. And they thought long term. So they think it took 100 years to get to where we are now, probably. So what can we do now that will help reverse that over the next 100 years? And most of us, if you're like me, you never think about that. The next minute seems like a long-term objective for you. But it's very helpful to think that way. So things that I might be doing now, I might not do if I'm thinking about 100 years from now. But of course, I do need to act now. I need to try to seek to reach people and disciple people now. But from the things that I'm going to say during this session are going to have that variation going, thinking about the short term as well as the very long term. Also institutional and individual. Probably most of us are interested in the individual, working with individuals. But my friends at this university, they're thinking institutional as well. If you work with college students in particular, you know that the university has its own life. It's an institution that has a set of values and a kind of worldview and so on, and it affects people in certain ways. And it didn't always do that. It wasn't always like that. So not quite the same distinction as short-term and long-term, but individual and institutional. And so I would just encourage you to think, kind of keep those things in mind as you think about discipling the next generation and using apologetics to do so. Okay, I'm now going to talk about the supplemental sheet. And what I want to do, to be very practical, is to talk about 4 books that I would recommend that pick up on different slices of this. The first one is Stephen Garber, The Fabric of Faithfulness. I've given you the full bibliographical information for all of these. It's an older book now, but Garber is here's the 4. James K. Smith, Desiring the Kingdom, David Horner, Mind Your Faith, and Christian Smith, Soul Searching. We'll briefly talk about the first 2. I'll say a little bit more about my book, number 3, and then we'll talk about Christian Smith's book as we get into the lecture as originally planned. So first of all, Garber. Garber is a seasoned discipler of students. For many years he's been involved in this. And this book, The Fabric of Faithfulness, is just outstanding in terms of an analysis of how students grow spiritually. And in particular, I just want to mention this part of his research. He said that there are 3 things, 3 differences in the students who are mentored as college students and are still following Jesus 20 years later, and those who aren't. And those are good things for us to know, right? And so he said the 3 big things. Number 1 is a worldview, that they had developed a worldview, a Christian worldview that made sense out of the world, and they learned it in such a way that they could engage other worldviews, they could understand them, and they could evaluate what was right and what was wrong about it. So they were able to understand their faith worldviewishly and engage other people worldviewishly. So they had an intellectual kind of framework. Number 2, they had a mentor. They had someone who invested their life in them. And number 3, they had a community, of people who had similar values, similar vision. And I would absolutely concur with all those three things as three determinant factors that will make all the difference in the world. So the apologetics side of it obviously is number one, but you, if you're an apologist working with these people, you may well be that mentor. And I would encourage you, if you're seeking to develop an apologetics ministry with young people, that you seek to develop a community of like-minded people that can help each other. The second book is by James K.A. Smith, called Desiring the Kingdom. And you might, if you've read this book, you might think this is an odd choice because it's almost the opposite of the first book. He doesn't like the word worldview, even though he holds a worldview chair at Calvin College. But he doesn't like apologetics. He doesn't like the kind of rationalism as he sees it with all this. His view is that we should develop students' desires through certain kinds of practices in community. Now, there's a lot I disagree with in this book, but I think mostly he overstates his case. There's a lot that is good there that we can take on board. In fact, at the end of the day, once he's made his noises against apologetics and everything, he kind of comes back around and pretty much agrees with all the rest of us on everything. He just wants to stress that he thinks that we through the way we live our lives in community and the things that we do together, the spiritual formation practices and so on, those actually are more determinative in terms of shaping what we believe and how we believe it than just reading books. And I think there's a lot that we should consider there. And I want to say a bit more about what I do in my book, because it's written for, particularly for college students. It's the fruit of many years of working with college students in campus ministry situations, including over here in Poland a little bit, back in the communist days. And now I'm a professor. And so I tried to put everything, or a lot of it, together, the things that I had developed. And so it's built around this kind of idea that young people have three big challenges that they're facing. One, of course, is moral. And so our culture is completely at odds with where they need to be. And this is true for pre-university students. It's certainly true for university students. Universities are kind of like big candy shops, and students are just let loose in there, and they don't have parental guidance anymore. Nobody telling them not to eat that candy, and it's a huge challenge. And all of these are related. Second, intellectual challenges, being confronted by ideas from every possible source, true ideas, false ideas, crazy ideas. How do I understand those things? How do I make sense of all of this? And then finally, spiritual challenges. In the United States, these are some statistics for the American church. 70% of American young people will drop out of church between the ages of 18 and 22. That is their college years. 80% are disengaged by age 29. So these are churched young people. And I would guess things are probably even more difficult in many of the countries in which you minister. In any case, what young people are facing is losing their mind, their faith, and their character. And so the approach that I take in this book is to cast a kind of positive vision about these years, rather than responding in fear and trying to escape what they're facing, rather than responding in folly, that's just jump in. I think the best way to approach it is to pursue flourishing. So if you think about college driving you crazy, or being a young person driving you crazy, losing your mind, your faith, and your character. The opposite is sanity, which comes from a Latin word which means health, wholeness, proper functioning, thriving, flourishing. And so my own view is to try to give students, the best way to go about it is to try to give students the tools and the encouragement and the vision to flourish within that context of being young people. And a kind of theme that goes throughout is what I call the Daniel model. And I know John Lennox spoke on Daniel in the past here, and I wasn't here, but Daniel, was a college student at Babylon University with his buddies, and they were challenged. And it's a great picture of someone who was in community with other students. They prayed together, they worshiped God together, but also they outthought the other people. They were successful not because they didn't run and hide, they just outperformed. It's one church historian said of the early Christians that they outthought, outlived, and outdied their culture. And so Daniel's a great example of flourishing, I think, in difficult circumstances as a young man. And in particular, learning to develop wisdom. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, I have 3 sections of the book that I break the book down into 3 sections now to talk about these 3 areas of mind, faith, and character. In terms of mind, I spend most of my time on this, how to think. And I've given you in your notes some things that I talk about, which I think are helpful things to help students learn to think. I think most apologetics questions that people are asking these days, and that may be too strong, but many apologetics questions that people are asking really have to do with confusions about truth and belief and knowledge and faith and science. So here are some of the things. I'll mention 3 areas that I focus on. First of all, casting a vision of the intellectual life, of loving God with our mind. This is something God has called us to do. This is a good thing. God gave us our minds. The importance of truth and reason. The fear approach to young people. Just don't think, just kind of put your head down. Don't really listen in class. These are evil people with bad ideas. Just don't commit sin. Don't lose your faith. That doesn't work very well for most people. It's a much better idea for us to help them become like the early Christians who outthought, outlived, and outdied their culture. Truth and reason are important. They're actually biblical things. Clarify misconceptions. One of the misconceptions they will have almost always learned is, there's the head and the heart. And God's not interested in the head, the intellectual side of things. He's interested in the heart, by which most people mean the emotions or the passion. And that's unbiblical, because the Hebrew notion of the heart includes the intellect and includes thinking and reason. So that's making a division, as we say in the marriage ceremony, what God has put together, let not man put asunder. This is putting asunder something that God put together. And so helping people through some of these misconceptions, and I do talk about all these things in the book. Second area, clarify crucial concepts. Here's some things that I think it's crucial for people to be able to navigate their way around and know what truth is, know what belief is, know what knowledge is, know what faith is, know what reason is, and know what science is. Almost every apologetic question that is really, really troubling to students right now is related to a confusion of one or more of these things. And then third, to cultivate some thinking skills. And I meant talk about 3 in the book. Thinking contextually. So understanding how to ask questions in order to understand where people are coming from and what they mean by what they say. Following Paul's example in Acts 17. Second, thinking logically, which I like to think of as asking good questions and giving good reasons. Being able to analyze and pull apart what people are saying. Learning the skills of asking really good questions and being able to understand what people are saying. Conversely, being able to give good reasons, be able to give good arguments, to know what a good argument is. Do you know who is the author of the single most influential logic texts of the 17th, 18th, and even the 19th centuries in English-speaking countries at least? There's these premier texts for Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, all of those. Went through 20 editions. Any idea? The author of this text? Isaac Watts, the father of the English hymn, who wrote Joy to the World, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, a pastor, a theologian, a devotional writer, and the most influential logician, logic instructor for several hundred years. We need to redeem logic, basic logic. Our students need to know how to recognize a bad argument. Now, we need to do it in a way that, just doesn't overwhelm them, and that's one thing I try to do in the book. And then thinking worldviewishly, being able to make the connections between different beliefs, presuppositions, and other beliefs, as Stephen Garber said, to be able to understand our worldview and to be able to relate it to other worldviews and be able to evaluate other worldviews in light of that. So that's all the mind stuff that I strongly think is important, so I'm throwing that out to you. Second, faith. Mind, faith, and character. I think students need to be able to answer what is faith, what is reason, how do they go together. I think a biblical answer would be that we need to have reasonable faith and faithful reason. They are inextricably linked. They're both gifts from God. They're not the same thing. But they're friends, they're not enemies. And so they need to be able to think through how to understand that. And by the way, the Bible never contrasts faith and reason. It's never even suggested in the Bible that faith could be unreasonable, except idolatry. If you look at Isaiah 44, you see God blasting idolatry because it's irrational. It's irrational faith. But faith in God is never, that's just not an issue. It's obviously irrational. The Bible contrasts faith with sight. And sight is just mere empiricism. So by faith we understand, as Hebrews 11 says, that reality is bigger than what we can see here and now and touch and feel. But that's not closing your eyes and being irrational. That's opening your eyes to a greater reality. They need to know how to respond to challenges to faith, doubts, and objections. I talk in here a lot about what doubt is, and some doubt is good. Some doubt is inevitable when you're trying to understand truth. What's bad doubt? These are just practical kind of skills in being able to navigate your way around an intellectually robust world. And then finally, apologetics. They need to know that faith is credible. They need to have some reasons for understanding that. And my own view is that the best way to talk about apologetics is to do it in a worldviewish way. And we can talk about that if you'd like. And then finally, character. Mind, faith, character. All of these are deeply connected, obviously. I think students need to have a vision for moral flourishing. They need to understand Christian ethics as a big yes that makes sense out of the no's that they have to say from time to time. But this is not, the central contrast in the Old Testament was not between right and wrong, it was between life and death. And the way of wisdom in Proverbs is the way of life. And Lady Folly says, all who love me love death. So being a Christian is not a way of saying no to a bunch of stuff. It's saying yes to life. And of course that means saying no to some things, but it makes perfect sense given the great yes. Emphasis on character versus just following rules, the importance of community. These are all things that I think are really crucial for students to think about in terms of, again, seeking to help students flourish as students. These are all parts of the Daniel model. Wisdom. Daniel and his buddies had to exercise wisdom to figure out when to take a stand and when not to. When they first were brought to Babylon, their names were changed to pagan names. It's not recorded that they made a big issue out of that. But when they were required to eat food that God had said don't eat, they had to make a big issue out of it, but they did so in a really wise way. Our students need to learn how to be salt and light, to be in the world but not of it. If you escape the world and you have a fear motivation where you're just trying not to think, not trying to engage with anybody, you're not in the world. You may not be of it, but you're not in it either. If you do the folly mentality, just jump in, you're in the world, but you're of it. So we need to help them, give them skills about developing wisdom. And then finally, at least in the United States, and I would assume it's true over here, there's a strong desire among Christian young people to live, to meet needs of people, to be involved in helping people who are poor, to be involved in helping to stop human trafficking. My daughter works for International Justice Mission now, which is an organization that's seeking to stop human trafficking and slavery. There's just a deep hunger to do something significant. Well, that's biblical, folks. And so one of our dangers, if we're apologetics-oriented folk, is to just talk about ideas all the time and try to get the right propositions in order. But I think a more biblical approach is not just to know the truth, not just to be able to articulate the truth, but to live it. And when our young people see that connection, that sort of integration of life, of action, with belief, they are motivated to keep going. Okay, that's just, I just want to give you some shots of ideas. Now let's go to the actual original lecture, and probably the last few pages we won't get to, which is the brainstorming time. But let's get into some of the meat of thinking about where are we. So again, I'm thinking short term and I'm thinking long term. Where are we with respect to young people, the sorts of people that we want to help disciple, and we're considering how does apologetics fit into this. And so if we're going to be strategic, I think we need to think about needs that are there, challenges that we face, opportunities that we might have, and strategies that we might use to employ. And so again, that's just sort of a big picture thing to inform and shape the way we think about all this, I think. Here's where I want to introduce something new. How many of you have heard of moralistic therapeutic deism? Okay. So here's where I would bring in the fourth book that helps to inform what we're talking about. And that is a book by Christian Smith, who's a sociologist. His original book, actually several books, but the original one that I've mentioned to you is Soul Searching. Christian Smith and a group of sociologists from the University of North Carolina did a several-year-long study with American young people concerning their spiritual beliefs, attitudes, and values, and so on. And came up with some very interesting results. He then later followed up on these folk when they were a little bit older, and now he's done it into the mid-20s, I think. And the picture is pretty consistent all the way throughout. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is because although these are American teenagers, I've presented some of these things to other Central European people working with college students, and they have told me this is the characterization. These are the people that I work with. We've talked about different kinds of worldviews, all these, the old way of thinking of worldviews, and they've all said, no, this is it. So moralistic therapeutic deism is the view that Christian Smith coined the term. Are you aware of what deism is? Deism is sort of the absentee landlord God view, right? That there's a kind of vaguely personal deity who started everything, created everything, but is not involved in the world. And Christian Smith is, if we had more time, we'd listen to an interview with him, but he describes how he would come home at night and he would say, I've been talking to Muslim teenagers, Roman Catholic teenagers, Mormons, Jewish, evangelical Christians, and they all have the same basic worldview. It's a kind of deism. God exists, he's kind of watching over everything, but he's not really involved in anything. Second premise, there are, I think, 5 premises here. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. So that's the moralistic side of it. He says it's generally pro-social. God wants us to be nice people. And as long as we're nice people, that's what's important. Third, the central goal in life is to be happy and feel good about oneself. Thinking of happy in the kind of individualistic, superficial sense of feeling good. So that's the central goal in life. God is not particularly involved in one's life except to resolve a problem. So when you need a parking spot or you're in trouble, you can invoke God. And then finally, good people go to heaven when they die. And almost everybody's good. So for those of you who can't see it very well, number 1, God exists and watches over humans. That's the deism part. 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. That's the moralistic side of it. Number 3, the central goal in life is to be happy and feel good about oneself. That's the therapeutic part of it. 4, God is not particularly involved in one's life except to resolve a problem. That's deism. So I don't have any sort of claim on my life that's not my own and that I need to live in a certain way. And then finally, good people go to heaven when they die, and pretty much everybody's good. Unless you're really bad, you exclude yourself. So Hitler might have excluded himself. But now, the interesting thing is, he said that these are evangelical teenagers, these are our unchurched teenagers, vaguely agnostic teenagers, these are Muslim teenagers, and I have had people from all of the countries represented in this room say, yes, this is the best characterization of the people that I work with. Now, I teach at a Christian university, and so I talk about this with my undergraduate students, and I play a little interview with Christian Smith, and then I ask, how many of you think this is true of your people, your generation? They all raise their hand. They all do it. Let's talk about this a little bit, okay? What needs, challenges, and opportunities, just stopping right there with moralistic therapeutic deism, assuming that's whether your students claim to be Christians or not, this is probably where they're coming from. And we don't want them to end up there. Just take a few minutes. Any comments on these needs that this, okay, that's better, or challenges or opportunities? Yes. Okay, Christless Christianity, yes. And in fact, one of the things, I'm glad you reminded me of this, one of the things in this interview with Christian Smith that he tags this to is he says that this is part of this being nice and people all go to heaven, that a lot of what's going on there is the desire to be tolerant. And he said students constantly talk about difference, but they don't actually, they aren't very different. It's kind of a monochrome view where actual difference, like believing in Christ, not just God, but believing in Jesus, that's offensive and it's difficult, and they just won't go there. So he says they speak in generalities but not particularities. He says, now especially with the evangelicals, if you ask them now explain why Jesus died on the cross, well, they can maybe produce the answer, a correct answer. But it's not something that actually informs their life, partly because he says it's so uncomfortable for them to actually talk that way out in the real world, that they've become, that they just want to be nice and they want to get along. And he says part of it, he says, even goes beyond the churches. He says there's very little ability among these young people to be able to actually engage difference well, to be able to articulate difference and to be able to understand an argument and so on, which of course goes back to my earlier thing about, I think this is part of it, is they really don't know how to formulate arguments and think and evaluate things. Maybe one or two other thoughts that come up. Yes? Yes, so the question is, or the comment is, this idea of everybody's good and so on, that includes, obviously I'm good and everybody else is like me. So it's very difficult in that climate to be able to help them understand that that's not the case. And so this would be, I think, given that, and we think of that's a challenge. And so, again, to be strategic, I think we need to think about some of these things, these needs, these challenges, and what are some opportunities maybe that we could use to try to shake that up a little bit. Those of us who went to Auschwitz yesterday, that would be a good counterexample. There are some films. We watched a film, that group that went to Auschwitz, called Weapons of the Spirit, and it was made by a Jewish filmmaker who was saved by a Christian village in southern France from the Holocaust. He's not a Christian, but he took a film crew back there and talked to the Christian rescuers who rescued him. And that might be actually a good thing to talk about, weapons of the Spirit, and that would get one into talking a little bit about the Holocaust and what that means for, what does that say about human beings and our character and so on. But also it has an example of people living the way people ought to live. So that's just a possible suggestion. But yes, and these challenges like that, the fact that they have this non-transcendent view of God, well, that's a challenge. We have to figure out creative ways through art and story and however we can do it to try to help break through that, because that's so deep. Same with this. Okay, how did we get here? Just a few thoughts on this. I want to suggest a couple of outside things that came from the outside, and then a few things that came from the inside. Os Guinness tells the story that he said it was a story that Khrushchev used to tell when he was the premier of the Soviet Union about a time in the Soviet Union when there was a wave of petty theft. So the workers were stealing the products from the factories. And so they posted guards at the different factories to try to catch the workers from stealing these things. And the story is that at the timber works in Leningrad, they posted a guard named Pyotr Petrovich who was friends with all the workers there. And so he's standing at the exit the first day, and out comes, or actually the guard was a friend of Pyotr Petrovich who was a worker there, and out comes Petrovich pushing a wheelbarrow with a large suspicious-looking sack on it. And so the guard stopped him and said, "Okay, Petrovich, I know you're smuggling something out of here, tip it out." Or actually he said, first of all, what's in the sack? He said, "Just sawdust and shavings." Yeah, right. So tip it out. So he tipped it out, and it was just sawdust and shavings. So Petrovich pushed it all back in and wheeled it off. The next night, out comes Petrovich with the wheelbarrow with a large, suspicious-looking sack in it. "Okay, Petrovich, what's in the wheelbarrow?" "Just sawdust and shavings." "Tip it out." So he tipped it out. It was just sawdust and shavings. The next night, the same thing happened. The next night, the same thing happened. It just kept happening. And finally, the guard was so frustrated that he said, "Okay, Petrovich, I know you're smuggling something out of here. Just tell me what it is, and I'll let you go." And he said, "Okay, wheelbarrows." Sometimes the most important thing is not what you're looking at. It's what's underneath what you're looking at. And I think of certain key assumptions as wheelbarrows, intellectual wheelbarrows, that we may not be aware of, but they're actually doing all the work, and they're derailing people from taking seriously truth, in particularly the truth of the gospel, the truth of the Christian worldview. And so I want to mention too that I think of as key wheelbarrows that have helped to develop the kind of climate that we're facing today with young people. First of all, scientism. Scientism is the view that all that is true and all that can be known is what science can determine. It's not the same as science. Science is the discipline of examining the world and trying to understand the regularities of certain events given natural laws and so on. Scientism is a philosophical view that says that our knowledge is limited to what science can deliver. Now, most people have never heard of scientism, right? But I would say most people actually hold it to be true. They assume it to be the case. So what happens is they just have this thing in their mind that if a scientist says it or it can be shown to be the case scientifically, then it's true or it's knowable. And if it's not that way, then it might be a matter of faith. It might be a matter of preference or opinion, but it can't be something that one knows. And so what happens is scientism is like a wheelbarrow. So we start talking about truth with respect to the Christian worldview or even ethics. And kind of what happens is the wheelbarrow starts derailing it, moving it away. Say, well, yeah, religion, that's not really true stuff. That's just preference or opinion. I had a debate coach tell me one time that if you want to persuade people, you need to answer their deepest objections. And you need to bring them to the surface and deal with them. And he said, think of them as little voices in their head, kind of saying, but what about, but what about, but what about? So I think scientism is one of those but what about things, okay? And so that unchallenged assumption lies behind the fact that we don't think that when we're talking about the existence of God and so on, we're talking about something that's true. We're just talking about things, and that's the only way it's possible for everybody basically to be right, which is the second thing, tolerance. I have it in quotes, and that's the typical view of tolerance today, which basically says that everybody's right and nobody's wrong, and it would be wrong to say that anybody's wrong. And it's obviously, we all know that it's incoherent, it's self-refuting, but it's very powerful. And again, most people have never thought very much about it, but this is where the little but what abouts come in for me. I know when I'm speaking to a secular university audience, but I also know that when I'm speaking to a church or a high school Christian, that this thing will come up. So here's how it goes. We start talking about the importance of whether or not Christianity is true. And I will say things like sincerity is important, but it's not enough to get us to the truth. And I tell the story of the nurse who sincerely believed that she was putting silver nitrate in the newborn baby's eyes, but it was actually acid. She was sincere, but her sincerity did not save the baby from blindness. Okay? Truth has to do with reality. And so sincerity in whether we believe in God or one kind of God or another or no God, sincerity is good. It's better than being dishonest. But that's not enough. What matters is, does God actually exist? Has God revealed himself definitively, and so on? Well, I know as soon as I go down here, there are these little voices in heads saying, but that's intolerant. Because we all know that if I actually believe that Christianity is true, what does that entail? The others are not true. Absolutely. So it can't be that way. It cannot be factually true. Well, then the scientism feeds into it. Oh yeah, but of course, this isn't really about knowledge and truth. This is faith. This is not like science, which is about reality. This is this other stuff. That's a way to settle in my mind that people can believe these things and they're not confronted with truth. And so what I do when I speak in these things, I think of those little voices saying, but that's intolerant. But that's intolerant. You're talking, the way you're talking. And so then at some point when I feel that the little voices are getting really strong in their heads, I stop and say, but isn't that intolerant? Whoa, everybody wakes up. And they're with me. I've got them. Because what I've done is raise the question to them. But of course I can't just leave it there. I have to deal with it. So I said, that's a great question. Tolerance is an important thing. But what is tolerance? Does tolerance mean that everybody's right in whatever they believe? Well, think about that. That would be just crazy. That would be intellectual suicide. Imagine a math class being taught from a tolerant point of view. What's 2 plus 2? Susie? 4. Excellent, Susie. You got the right answer today. Billy, you usually have an opinion. What do you think 2 plus 2 is? 5. Excellent, Billy. You got the right answer too. Johnny, what do you think? 257. Excellent, Johnny. Today, as every day, class, we all got the right answer, and don't we feel so good about ourselves? Well, obviously, we can pray that the engineers who built this building didn't take math that way, right? So people, they understand, okay, yeah, there is such a thing as objective truth, but what's the next question, do you think? Yeah, but that's math. That's true for math and science. But we're talking about God, scientism. So these two wheelbarrows do a lot of work together. And so these are two things that I think it's really important for us to be able to help our students be able to figure out how to negotiate and understand. So for them, we have to pull the wheelbarrow. We have to make the wheelbarrow visible and deal with it. I think these two things, and they're both incoherent. This view of tolerance is it's wrong to say that anything's wrong. Thou shalt be tolerant, and thou shalt not tolerate anyone who isn't. Scientism is also incoherent. Scientism is the view that only what science can establish can be true. Is that true? Yeah. Can science establish that? No. That's a philosophical claim. So they're kind of dumb mistakes, actually, but they do a huge amount of work. So those are two, if we're asking from the outside, what has helped contribute to the soil, we might say, of moralistic therapeutic deism, a kind of view of Christianity as mindless and tame and a loss of a real robust valuing of the mind in the church. These are two important things from the outside. From the inside, we've bought into some views of disintegrating mind, faith, and character. So again, science is what is true or false, and you can have knowledge about. I'll go back here to this. It says no mind this way, mind without faith, and mind and faith without character. And I could put them all these different ways if you want, but it's separating. Part of it is the scientism and tolerance. Part of it is really poor theology about truth. The Hebrew word for truth, emet, refers both to being dependable and faithful, being a true person, being authentic, being reliable, and to telling, when we tell things, they actually correspond to reality, both faithfulness and factuality. Postmodernists are really into faithfulness, and they deny the factuality. Sometimes apologists are really into factuality, and they're not so interested in living it out. Biblical view is both. Our minds are created by God. I'm not sure what the timing is here. Can you? Okay, kind of where I'm. Oh, 15 minutes. Okay, great. And so from the inside, the churches have, Christians, we've kind of lost a vision for the life of the mind. We're afraid of it. And so we've bought in, we've kind of colluded with scientism and tolerance to devalue devalue our understanding of the mind and the value of truth and knowledge. One of the greatest guys to be calling us back to understanding Christianity as a knowledge tradition. He would not call Christianity a faith tradition because he felt the faith had been so diluted in meaning. And here's a great quote from Dallas Willard. People perish for lack of knowledge because only knowledge permits assured access to reality. And reality does not adjust itself to accommodate our false beliefs, errors, or hesitations in action. Life demands a steady hand for good, and only knowledge supplies this. This is as true in the spiritual life as elsewhere. When we want to get surgery, we don't just go to somebody who is very sincere and has a great heart. We go to somebody who really understands how the human body works and is skilled. So we value knowledge when it comes to certain kinds of professions, and yet we just have this view of what the Bible teaches, the moral life, and so on. Is well, what really matters is if you have a good heart. So those are a few initial suggestions. I'm going to give one more, and then I just wanted to open up to our discussion. Here's one factor that I'd like you to think of, other factors of how we got here. How did we develop? Maybe it was 100 years ago, maybe it was 20 years ago. A soil that would give rise to this sort of situation that we face, and how do we deal with it?